Welcome to the podcast where sustainability gets real. I'm Alan Stenson, I'm your host, and in each episode we uncover the people, ideas and actions driving the journey to net zero. Let's get into it.
Welcome back to Emission Possible, the podcast where we talk about sustainability, ESG and the journey to net zero. I am absolutely delighted to be having a very good friend of mine, a key guest on the podcast. We're going to be looking at what happens when responsible business moves beyond ambition and starts to enable it to become part of how the organization actually runs. Kirsty Shearer is the Operational Excellence Director at Agilité, an international commercial interiors and fit-out specialist across Europe and now America as well. Agilité are an NCZ Platinum certified organization, B Corp and EcoVadis. But for me, what makes the story particularly interesting is not simply the number of external standards that have been achieved, but it's more how the business is actually using those frameworks to strengthen its operation, engage with its supply chain and actually maintain its values whilst continuing to grow, which I think is no mean feat. So Kirsty, it's an absolute pleasure. Welcome to Emission Possible.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. So we're going to dive straight in. I think what would be really good is for anyone who isn't familiar with Agilité, if you could maybe give us a brief introduction to the company, the work that you do and the markets that you operate in.
Of course. So we are Agilité. We set up this business back in 2008 and we're a commercial interior specialist. We set up the business in Paris. And we've then expanded the business across different geographies, mainly across Western Europe. And the idea is very much to deliver commercial solutions to office, retail and hospitality clients all across Europe, looking at making sure how we can deliver, where possible, consistent projects in those different markets, but with a focus on sustainability and how we can do that, not just purely from the environmental point of view, but making sure that the business is there to last the length of time. Because we were a small business and when we set this up, we had the opportunity to be able to structure this how we wanted to and very much put the idea of sustainability at the forefront of what we do. So the idea was to look at following our clients across those different markets and different geographies to be able to deliver for them in all of those different areas. My role is operational excellence and looking at how do we deliver that consistency across the different business that we work with, from client experience to the quality of the projects that we deliver, the health and safety, the engagement with our supply chain. Obviously, there is local nuances in all of the different markets that we operate in and the maturity of those markets and our maturity within them. But the idea is striving for consistency in terms of what we do across those different areas.
How did you, in terms of responsible business, how did that become such an important part of the business's identity and growth strategy?
I think the construction industry has had such a bad name for such a long time, but we are also a big contributor in terms of the emissions that we create, the resources which we use on a wider industry perspective. So even though the fit out industry is a little less intensive, it's also a lot less regulated in terms of the materials. There's a lot of choice out there for people to use to put onto their projects. So it was an opportunity to say, how can we differentiate ourselves and how can we look at being a business that's built for the future? Everything at the moment is moving so quickly in terms of the technological advancements, but also the information that we know about the environment and what we need to be doing to try and put the brakes on what we're doing in terms of contributing negatively to the environment. So it was an opportunity when we set this up to say, how do we start to think about this from an end product point of view? And how does that life cycle of that product and service that we deliver actually have a reduction in the negative impact that it's having? And how do we build that into what we do? It wasn't an easy thing to start to do.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, maybe talk us through how you found that process in terms of trying to have that as your perspective and your angle.
I think initially when we first started out, it was a case of how do we obviously do the basics of what we need to do, deliver our projects, win work, to be able to exist, to be able to have an impact and albeit a positive one. And there was a few things out there that we already knew about, obviously our ISO standards and actually putting some best practice in place to make sure that we were following the different standards and industry best practice that we needed to do to make sure we could deliver our business. However, it's not just about kind of understanding what those standards are, it's how do you embed them in your business. And also, there's a lot of requirements from clients as well to make sure that you are, in some respects, ticking certain boxes on a pre-qualification form to make sure that they're understanding that you have a responsible and a business that is governed by process and structure. So some of the ISOs were some of the first places we started, but thinking about the broader sustainability piece, it was actually quite hard to think about how do you build that framework and how do you have something that you can work to? And this is where the B Corp piece became really relevant for me. It wasn't just about looking at the environment. It was about looking at workers. It was about looking at the community in which you operate in. It's looking at governance. It was looking at your supply chain. So looking at that whole holistic piece of what does sustainability really mean? And obviously over the course of the last few years, B Corp have developed their standards and it covers a broader perspective. That was the initial framework that gave us the ability to put something together to say, how do we follow a framework like this to help us put the necessary standards, processes, policies and procedures in place as a business to be able to do that? And obviously being an internationally recognized standard, because when you're trying to deliver in multiple different countries and there are local nuances that you need to be aware of, how do you take something that sits as that at that level that is recognized and understood in all of those different markets?
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any sort of key elements of those frameworks individually that have brought something special to the business? Because I know obviously from your perspective, it's building it in, so it's integral into how you operate. Is there anything in terms of like B Corp, EcoVadis, NCZ that has helped you in terms of those frameworks?
I think they're all different. And as we said at the beginning, it's not just about trying to get certificates to have them as a badge of honour. It's about how do you start to build them in to your business as a cultural shift? And everything comes down to behaviours and the culture that you create as a business. But how do you build that behaviours into the teams, into your supply chain and everything else? So I think they all have very different things to offer. B Corp very much gave us that initial framework and allowed us that place to be able to set out a structure that we have been able to develop over the course of the last 3 to 4 years until we're now at a recertification point. EcoVadis became something that people were talking about an awful lot more. And this links back far more into, I would say, our supply chain and how we're developing that piece within our supply chain. And EcoVadis has been a very heavily recognised standard in the French market, which is one of our biggest markets. And it became something that a lot of our clients were asking for. And we said, well, there's the part equivalent. There are different ways where EcoVadis and B Corp can be seen, advantages, disadvantages in the way that certain things are monitored. But it actually became, this isn't about the certification. It's actually about the processes we put in place. So if there's things we can still learn from becoming EcoVadis certified, how can we bring those into our overall business to make sure we're following all of those different areas? And I think what's been really fascinating for us is the NCZ Platinum program, because you can't start to do anything about what you're doing if you can't measure what it is that you're doing. And I think that was our biggest issue with our carbon footprint. At the beginning, I didn't know what that was. I didn't really have a metric to be able to understand or to calculate it. So starting off to becoming gold was quite an interesting journey for us, and understanding our emissions as a business, looking at our scope 1, scope 2. But our scope 3 emissions are where our biggest impact is in terms of our supply chain, in terms of what we deliver. So I think there's been an evolution there, but the initial part was understanding where do we stand, and then what's our benchmark, and how do we look to improve our intensity metric to make sure that we are moving in the right direction. So they all have different things to offer. But again, like I said before about the ISOs, it's important that we don't just look at them as, we're going through an audit or we're looking through recertification. It should be processes that we build into our business. And these just become how we do business, not the fact that we're going for recertification through an audit process. It should be about how do we build these processes into this is just what we do.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think what the framework enables an organization to achieve is understanding the importance of accountability, so that we know we are working towards achieving certain things and we have got processes in place to be able to do that. You can then evidence what you're doing because you have the systems in place, but also you're able to be open about what still needs to be improved. This isn't, nobody's expecting this to be perfect overnight. So being able to be open and honest and transparent about where your challenges are, what you can achieve now and what you can't, and then having, a plan in place to actually start to affect change. Yeah. And from an NCZ perspective, I mean, it's been the classic route to maturity. I mean, you started at that gold level to really understand the baseline, understand the overall picture of like, where are the emissions coming from and what's in our control, what's outside of our control, and then what? So what do we now need to do? And clearly the Platinum program is where you guys are really excelling, because that's the majority of your footprint, and that's where that engagement process is so key. Maybe talk us through some of the challenges of, engaging with that wider supply chain, because you guys have probably some complexities that others may not have in terms of, geographical location and where your suppliers are, where your where operations are. I mean, maybe talk us through some of the challenges that you faced through that process.
I think, as you just said, it's really important to think about this as a journey, and the idea of measuring all of these things and getting these certifications is about looking at how you put a structure in place to get that consistency and continuous improvement. This isn't about saying how great you are. It's about looking at where are the gaps, how can we improve, and giving the teams a bit of a structure to work on too, because I think quite often we get into this, it's fine, recertified, or we met our targets. Okay, but now how do we improve? And I think that's what the programs are there to do. And you have to keep continually improving in order to keep up. Otherwise you fall down. The percentage scales change. But I think the supply chain piece is fundamental to how we as a business need to improve. We're only as good as the people we work with, the suppliers that we work with, and the markets and the government initiatives that are put in place at the same time. The big challenges that we have around supply chain is obviously any engagement piece needs to be done in local language. So we need to be considering how we engaging with that supply chain. And so it can't be a blanket communication piece across in English or in French or in anything else. It needs to be localized to what is possible within that market. There are also market nuances in terms of how we're dealing with waste, for example, or what are we expecting from that client, from that supplier, to give us the necessary information. So asking for the same types of waste notes, they're not quite consistent, and there's different measures that are in place in some of those different markets. Some suppliers we have already have a lot of this information. They have ready-made data. They're able to provide it to you, and it's simple, it's straightforward. They're already doing it. Whereas we've got obviously smaller suppliers as well, which they are busy doing their day job, and this at the moment possibly isn't on their radar. And how do you help support them on that journey? We're not going to use you because you're not doing it. How do we help you on that journey? And I think, again, that's part of where the program's really helpful, because it gives those suppliers the opportunity to measure their own impact and their own carbon footprint as part of this journey. And that's a support that's given to them that doesn't cost them anything to be able to do for the first year, and they're able to move through that process and start to take the necessary steps to enable us to stay on, obviously on our supply chain, but other people's supply chain as well, and help them to get a bigger footprint in terms of the market that they operate in. But it is a difficult piece, because getting people's engagement, everybody's busy, people are looking at fighting to tendering their next jobs, working on the jobs they already have, and again, this administrative level in the background, sometimes people see it as a box ticking exercise, but it's very much looking at the future. How do we keep that supply chain moving? How do we in turn keep our own processes moving and help the supply chain come with us on this journey? We don't have a huge supply chain. It isn't about having lots and lots of people on there. It's about how do you have partners and how do you work with them to make sure that we're able to have enough work to be able to be shared around that supply chain and have the right suppliers doing the right jobs. So I think it's a really important point, and it is something that we're definitely on a journey. It's definitely not perfect, but we've started it, and it is about engagement. How do you have that communication with them as well? It's not just about telling them this is what has to be done. It's about, okay, what are the opportunities? If you can't do it this way, what can we do? How can we receive the data? How can we change things? Can we reuse things? Can we take things from one project, use them onto another? Can we put that into a community project that's also having an impact elsewhere? So there's lots of different ways to think about this, but how do we work together as a broader team rather than it just being focused on us and them? And how do we make sure that, and again, with the client as well, understanding what those needs are?
Yeah, bang on. We're reaching sort of those challenges in terms of the maturity of the supply chain. We're talking to suppliers and asking them for information, and they may or may not be on that journey. And if they're not, then actually there's a relatively strong social message around engaging with those suppliers and helping them to start their journey to net zero who perhaps hadn't done before, and they are because they're part of your program. So that's obviously a knock-on effect that's very, very positive. And you are going to get the varying different levels of maturity within that supply chain. But when we look at maybe the client, what are you seeing in terms of the expectation from the client's perspective? So with those tenders and with those questions that are coming through, what are you starting to see now over the last sort of few years?
We're definitely getting more questions around how are we managing our environmental, our social, our governance impacts on our projects and wider. We should be around the right ballpark in terms of price. We should be around the right ballpark in terms of program, potentially with acceleration. These should be givens in terms of what we do. These other elements now are becoming differentiators in what we do, but they're also becoming prerequisites. They're not negotiables anymore in terms of what we're being asked for.
Yeah.
And I think what's important here is about being able to give not just necessarily certifications, it's about being able to give examples and real life examples of where you've tried something and the value that it has actually been able to give. You need to be able to not just say you care about sustainability and have a pretty page as part of your tender process, but looking at how you really are going to look at social engagement, how we're going to be measuring some of these aspects: air quality, noise, carbon footprint, reusability, recyclability, all of these things. We now need to be giving quite important statistics in terms of what we're doing and examples of where we've done it on other projects, and the impact that has had, because I think that is where you start to give real value to what it is that you're doing. And it's definitely something that we're seeing far more. I think we're all being driven by initiatives, European directives in terms of how do we improve our overall businesses, regardless of what industry we're in. And our physical locations are often our biggest impact. So how do we, as a fit out contractor, be able to help with that? And also when we got good supply chain, and supply chain with good statistics, references, data points, all of that helps the client's impact at the end of the day. I think quite often we think we're looking either at cost or we're looking at all these different drivers, or speed to get into a building or a retail unit to get open quicker so they can start trading. But all of these things are starting to then look at impacting the client's information too, in terms of their overall impact. So the more we can feed this data from our raw materials to our supply chain as executing the work, giving that data all the way up the chain is starting to give us far more clarity in terms of the circularity of what it is that we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's genuine value that your customers need and are only going to need more, but they can't get it unless you provide it to them. So it's, you use the word partner before, you are a partner to your customer. And if there's insight that you can provide and confirmation and credible evidence to show that they made this decision and that's how much of a carbon reduction it generated, that helps them on their journey of getting to net zero, because they're all in the same challenge that we're all in. They need to know how to get there, and most of it's outside of their control. So if they know they're working with a supplier that will genuinely help them to achieve that, and they can evidence that, that's a very, very powerful level of support to give a customer, and you genuinely move from supplier to partner at that point. Yeah, great to hear that. And also, one of the things I think that's always really impressed me about you guys is that wanting to add value has always been at the forefront of why you're doing what you're doing, and the fact that you went through the whole life cycle assessment process to model the emissions associated with what you do for each client. So each type of service that you're providing, you can provide that level of insight, because that's valuable to your customer. And being able to provide client specific reporting makes it so specific that that isn't just the overview or a number. It's insight, it's understanding of what already has been done, what is being done, and when it's going to get to net zero. And that's incredibly valuable to a customer. So, well, I mean, I don't know if you're able to name any names, but has this been anything that's supported or significantly helped in terms of particular client expectations and delivering something that, meets their need?
We've had some fabulous clients over the years, and what is quite interesting is some of them are really, really, really committed to this, and they are very much driving some of the agenda forward in terms of the targets that they set in terms of percentage reduction in carbon emissions on the previous project that they did. So I think all of these things actually start to change the metrics that we're as interested in, and how do we start to make those improvements? And when you start to think about it differently, and when the client's on board, it is amazing what you can do. And like you just said about the life cycle assessments, when you start to plug that information in ongoing through the project, you really start to see where the differences are and the decisions that you can take that really do have a massive impact. And often it's the small things. And I think we kind of focus sometimes on really big, impactful areas, and they are impactful, but it's small things. I'll never forget someone telling me that if we change the underneath the faucet on the tap and it changes the flow speed. Now, is anybody in the office going to complain whether it takes me 10 seconds or 12 seconds to actually fill up my glass of water, whatever the statistic is? And it's quite an interesting one, but actually we stop wasting so much water. So no, it doesn't hit the project costs, but it hits the actual life cycle of that building and the occupation of it. And it's when we start to think about really small, minor changes with a piece that costs a couple of pounds. It's a very different way of looking at things it's not all big investment and big structural things that we need to be changing. It's little things, it's habits, it's behaviors and amendments that we can make if we're prepared to think about things slightly differently.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I love that. I think that's so telling because, again, you're educating the customer that they can actually make a difference and it is possible. And it doesn't have to be huge investment. It doesn't have to be a massive project. It can be relatively minor or minimal changes that can actually ultimately and collectively result in a significant change. So yeah, I love that. I mean, you guys are a rapidly growing organization, and when it comes to sustainability and all the steps that you guys are taking, has that become harder to manage as the company grows internationally? And how have you found that process?
Growth always comes with various different challenges, and the overall complexity does obviously increase, especially with the international structure of our business as well. But I think it's how do you build in at that point structure? You can't have any more kind of informal values at the size that we are now. You have to look at how do we become a bit more structured and a bit more tailored to what we do, which does require things like documentation for accountability. And if we actually do that properly, that growth, actually, it can have much bigger influence. So how do we make sure we do this and we do it well? And that structure and accountability that you need to bring to it really does start to make a difference. But the challenge is, how do you stay consistent, become more structured, but without taking away all that flexibility and all that agility that you have within your business? Because what makes you good at the beginning, how do you maintain that, but creating the structure that goes with it is a complicated piece. But if we can build the structure in, as we said, looking at these frameworks, and if you can embed that into the culture and behaviors of what you do, by no means at the end of this journey, we're very much at the beginning of the journey, but how you can build it into the culture and behaviors of your business, that is where the real magic happens, because you are able to then, it becomes systematic as to what you do. No one thinks about it as a process I have to follow. It's just what we do.
And are you seeing that colleagues are encouraged to see sustainability as part of their own role rather than just the responsibility of one person or department? Are people engaged internally and understand the role that they play and are happy to play that role?
It's always a journey as you grow and as you become bigger. But from the very beginning, it's always been a case of how do we start to build all of these, sustainability being one of them. How do we build them not into kind of verticals? How do we build them into the various different areas of the business, from communication to delivery to quality to health and safety? How do we bring all of this together? It shouldn't sit as a separate piece that can be easily removed because it costs too much, or it's not convenient to do, or it's a bit too hard on this project. We need to look at It might be the biggest element, but how do we look at taking an element on each of the projects that we are doing? And it does need to filter into your decision-making process on procurement. It needs to filter into your cost-making decisions as to what it is that we're doing. We've moved into a situation where a couple of years ago, certain materials, it was cost prohibitive to use. The sustainable materials market has moved on considerably over the last few years. And so there are now very cost-effective alternatives to products, materials that are available in the quantum that people need, which sometimes wasn't the case before. There wasn't enough supply and demand. That has very much changed. And I think we now have so many more opportunities, but we need to think outside the box. We need to go to different suppliers, different manufacturers to have that varied reliability on those products and materials. So I think, yes, we've got, obviously, there are some people that are far more passionate about it than others, but by and large, it is people see it as a benefit to what they do. And often you can see that value, and that value comes out in client experience. It comes out in quality of the project, and often the people you have involved in it as well, because when you've got suppliers and material producers that are really passionate about the products and materials that they have been able to produce, them being seen in use on projects. So there is definitely a feel-good factor to it, for sure. And I think it is having an impact in terms of getting people on board, but it can't sit as a separate item that becomes too expensive. It needs to move to the side. It needs to be integrated into every area. How do we reuse? How do we make different decisions on what travel needs to be done? Travel of materials, travel of people, and that carbon footprint as well, because sometimes we don't always consider time and travel as a cost in some of these things. I don't necessarily mean a monetary cost. I mean an environmental cost, a carbon cost in terms of what it is that we're doing. So how do we look at that reporting as well? When you start to see the statistics that come out in terms of what reductions we were able to make, either with reuse or material selection, again, it's a really good feel-good factor, and often becomes a good financial sense as well, as to when the type of materials that you've used and the longevity of them, and potentially the recyclable and the reusability of those materials post-project.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of communicating what you do, what would you say gives credibility to sustainability communication? What does that look like, and how do businesses avoid the sort of greenwashing trap?
I think it's about being honest, avoid vague declarations of how perfection and how wonderful you are and all of the things that you've achieved. Be honest, be very specific about the metrics that you're looking at. We started at this number, we have made possibly an increase, but your intensity metric has maybe come down. What are the numbers that you're talking about, and how do you give that specificity? The specific element of what specificity that you need to give. So I think it's really important that you are giving clear information, and look at where the progress needs to be made, and identify the challenges that you're having, because other people will likely be having those same challenges too. And I think we shouldn't be afraid of talking about them, because there will be other people either within our industry or externally that have different options. Like I came to your cleaning forum a couple of weeks ago, and it was really interesting to hear from how different industries are dealing with coping with some of these elements themselves, and how can you feed those back into kind of cross-fertilization of ideas across different industries. And I don't think we do that enough, and we need to be not afraid of sharing where we're not doing so well and where we can improve. Stating our impact.
Totally agree. I think we should be celebrating. Yeah. I totally agree. I think we shouldn't be afraid to celebrate the progress, but at the same token, we should be totally honest and transparent about the challenge. And, if we haven't finished, that's okay. Like if we can't achieve what you want to achieve, that's okay. That's the reality. That's the world that we're in. You can't do everything. And even if the will to do it is there, the technology might not exist yet, or the pricing point might not be where it needs to be, and so on. So many different aspects.
I think it's really important, being open and honest. I think internally it's how do you build trust within your teams, but externally, how do you actually build credibility by giving open and honest information around what you've actually produced. And I think that's key to the communication of how we do things.
Yeah, absolutely right. What's next on the horizon in terms of the priorities for the business from a responsible business perspective and your carbon journey? What's next in terms of Agilité's plan?
I think the next piece for us is the continuation of our supply chain. We have got to make sure that it's an ongoing piece. It will never end, but that is still very much a key focus for us in all of the different markets and some more of the emerging markets that we're working in as well. So taking that time, making sure that you have that engagement and feedback, because there's an awful lot we can learn from our supply chain too. I think one of the other key areas is making sure that we are understanding more about our scope 3 emissions. How can we reduce travel where possible? How can we look at all of the other elements that encompass our scope 3 emissions? Quality of the data that we're receiving, that's important as well. And how do we get to a point where we could be doing an LCA on every single project that we're doing? This is a journey, and how do we gather more accurate data? Maybe simplify some of the things that we're looking for, but making sure that we're actually gathering consistent year-on-year information and then looking at how do we put sensible improvement plans in place. So I think it's about making that into everyday decisions. So it's not about trying to say we're going to make big sweeping differences in terms of what we do, but it's how do we make this into just day-to-day decision-making, procurement choices, and actually looking for new and developing supply chain as well, because sometimes they don't meet financial criteria to be automatically selected on certain supply chain qualifications, but it's how do you work with them to help those new materials, innovative materials get to market. So I think there's this partnership piece is really important, and being open to see who's out there, who's new, what people are doing, what innovation there is to do that. But ultimately, and then actually just improving the impact reporting that we're doing. So the more data we can gather and the more accurate data we can gather is the most important things. Don't try and do too many different things. Keep it simple. Take things as one thing at a time, and don't try and overstretch yourself, because you will only be setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah, 100% right. What would be a piece of advice maybe you could give to a business that wants to become more responsible, but they're unsure where they should be beginning this process?
Take a couple of small things and see if you can implement them across every aspect of your business. Don't try and take too many. Just take some little things that you can think, we could implement this, and build on that. Report on it, gather momentum, and then look at where you can take that further in your journey.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, I love that. So what is one responsible business improvement that is possible for almost every company to begin making now?
Start measuring the information that you have. Start measuring the data that you have, especially around your carbon impact. And there are plenty of people that can help you do that. But start understanding where you are so you can create a baseline. And every business should be able to do that.
Love that. Next one. What currently gives you the greatest optimism that business can become a force for positive change?
I think there really is a want and desire to see us create an environment, a world that future generations can enjoy as we have. I think there are lots of things we need to do to change, but I think there is definite positivity in the fact that people do actually want to see that happen. I think people's biggest challenge is they don't know what to do to help affect positive change. But I am genuinely inspired on an almost daily basis how some people come up with fantastic ideas and are creating new businesses, are creating new products, are thinking differently about how we can do things that really does look at how we can potentially build a businesses being a force for good. And I think the idea is focusing far too much on the financial part of business generation. It's an important, fundamental part, because if you don't make financial gains on your business and you don't have a profitable business, you can't exist to continue to do what we do in terms of looking at making positive change. But I think it is incredibly important that that isn't the be all and end all. And we know that so many different stories around how people have made really sensible environmental decisions that have taken their business to financial improvements almost overnight by the way that they've done it. And they've actually taken that investment in the early stages.
Yeah, absolutely. One final question. Well, not even a question. If you can you complete this sentence for me? So meaningful progress becomes possible when?
Ooh, good intentions are turned into systems, decisions that are able to actually drive positive outcome. Not treating sustainability as a separate exercise, but start building how we operate it on a day-to-day basis.
Boom. I love that. That's a great way to wrap up. Thank you, Kirsty. I really appreciate you giving us the time and being on the pod. I know we've talked about it a few times now, and great to finally get you locked in. But yeah, for me, some of the key takeaways have been that understanding where the real value comes from the steps that you're taking. So the fact that you're achieving what you're achieving is amazing. But what's even more impressive is what you're using those frameworks to actually achieve from the business full stop, of where you can add that value, where you can create that extra level of accountability and that common thread of evidence. So yeah, I absolutely love that. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the pod.
Thanks for listening to Mission Possible. If today's episode sparked an idea or presented a challenge, please reach out and let us know. Subscribe, share, and stay tuned, because net zero is absolutely possible.